First episode, we talked about low-latency HLS and what got us to this point. Now comes where we were building up to, which is Apple's newly released spec.
It's super interesting. While we're kind of a long way from the original conversations and the original specification, I actually don't think we're that far at all. The initial specification had a requirement to push parts over HTTP 2. When you think about how HLS works at a fundamental level, the fundamental mechanisms and the fundamental thought process behind this specification hasn't really changed.
I'm Matt, the organizer of the SF Video Technology Meetup and the Demuxed conference.
And I'm Steve, creator of Video.js, the open source video player.
And I'm Phil, streaming specialist at Mux in London and organizer of the London Video Technology Meetup.
And you're listening to Demuxed, a podcast for and by engineers working with video.
Demuxed is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com.
We're always looking for topics, so if you have any suggestions or just want to tell us how wrong we are, you can find us on Twitter at Demuxed.
Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of the low-latency HLS series. I guess 2 things are a series. we're without Hef today. And when I say without, I mean we're celebrating Hef today. He just had his second child, so he is out on leave, paternity leave, and hopefully he'll be around for the next episode. But we're not going to have him today because he's enjoying a new life in his family. So that's great.
So lucky. Congratulations, Hef.
Congratulations, Hef. If you see him on Twitter, which you won't because he's not on Twitter really, you should tell him congratulations or send him an email.
You should tell him to get off Twitter is what you should do.
You should probably tell him to get off Twitter. So yeah, first episode, we talked about kind of the background of low-latency HLS and what got us to this point, community specs, Apple stance, what latency looks like in these different ways of delivering video, blah, blah, blah. And so now comes kind of where we were building up to, which is Apple's newly released spec. So before we jump in to talking about the new spec in detail, can you give us a quick TLDR on what we're seeing in this new spec?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea before we get really into the weeds of it. So the new spec is oriented around delivering what Apple are calling parts. We'll talk a bit more about those. You can just think of these as sub-segments, really, and those can either be transport stream segments or Cmaf chunks. And there's a new playlist syntax to advertise these little parts, which are between, a third of a second, let's say, and about a second on the bottom of a manifest. There's then 2 new blocking behaviors that are in the specification. One is a blocking playlist reload, as Apple calls it. So this is allowing you to request a manifest update. And this is another part of it is manifest updates or delta updates to manifests are just little bits at the end of a manifest, so you don't have to load a full manifest anymore. And fundamentally, you can ask for these before they're generated. So that's blocking playlist updates, the second part of it. The third piece of it is blocking preload hints, which is the ability to advertise these parts before they actually become available. So again, you can ask for a part and you have to block on the server side and then respond to a part when it's available. Those parts have to be delivered over HTTP 2. That's another piece of the puzzle. And then finally, there's something called Rendition Reports as well, which are designed to allow you to jump faster between different renditions within a piece of media.
Awesome. Okay, then let's get into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I can't remember when we recorded the last one. I'm not going to give away real world dates, but it's a couple of weeks since we recorded the last one, obviously. And the exciting things happened since then is we've had a Wwdc, right? Don't have one of those every day, but we had one of those. And it was, I don't know, I really enjoyed Wwdc this year with it going online. A lot of the content felt a little bit more, cleaned up. I don't know, it was actually really great. I really enjoyed it. And kind of the big news from a low latency perspective is we kind of all knew there were a lot of changes ongoing in the specification, but there is now kind of a timeline for that being available in Apple's platform. So low latency HLS will be available to everyone as described by Roger in iOS 14, tvOS 14, watchOS 7, for all your this is on the list for all your low latency video on your watch requirements.
And it's dead.
Yeah, okay. It's really low latency for about 5 minutes, and macOS as well. So that's macOS 11, I believe, technically, and I have forgotten the code name. Matt will know it off the top of his head. Big Sur. I remember it. Big Sur. That's it. macOS Big Sur.
Nice. Okay.
Which I believe is macOS 11 according to the pre-builds.
I was about to say Catalina, and I'm pretty sure that was like 3 versions ago.
That's a while ago now. But beyond that was, and with the kind of available to everyone, the requirement to use an entitlement to enable low latency HLS is seemingly gone in these releases.
Could you tell me what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So really what that means is, with the pre-release, there was what's called an entitlement, which is kind of these flags you set on your app. When you put it in for App Store review, that might enable certain features that aren't available to everyone. And low latency playback was behind one of these flags because Apple didn't want to let everyone get access to it. And I'm not actually sure that any app made it into the App Store with that entitlement. But this new version won't have any flagging or anything. It will just be enabled by default. Now, what, as far as I understand it right now, is interesting is I don't think this is going to be available in macOS's Safari natively. I think it is going to be behind kind of the app layer right now, or at least it didn't seem to work in the testing I was doing. So I think it is going to still be hidden in kind of, you need to be using AV player a little bit beyond it just being enabled. Now, that might be a bug or something, but it's certainly going to be, when you're using like an AV player on iOS or on tvOS or, in iPad OS, it'll be there and available. So that might look a little bit different, but it should all be there and magically working with no magical entitlements needed. And what I think is super exciting about that is, beyond that, the work that's been done really has brought kind of every HLS feature into that release. So this isn't going to break anything. You're still going to be able to do things like add insertion. You're still going to be able to do DRM. You're still going to be able to do all the other cool things you still do with HLS today, but you're going to be able to do them at low latency. Admittedly, in some cases, a couple of changes to how you do it, but it will be fundamentally compatible with all of those HLS feature set, which I think is really exciting for an ecosystem. There's relatively little sacrifices happening there.
The Safari decision feels big. I mean, I'm going to put tinfoil hat on for just a second. Love all of you at Apple, I promise. But like on one side of things, that's a huge incentive to go native versus web. And that would suck. That would suck really bad if they were just like, you have to use MSE, which is like questionably supported anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's going to be super interesting if they don't choose to do it. It would feel like a weird decision. One of the weird things was, like, even if you put a low latency HLS stream into Safari today in the current macOS, you actually get it trying to make some part requests. And so something obviously slipped into a macOS release somewhere. And I don't know whether that's been kind of backed out or what the real plan is there. But yeah.
Okay, so we can just assume it's not ready yet, not that it's not coming.
I think it's not ready, is my gut instinct. It certainly is ready under AV Player, which is great. So that's probably the most exciting thing anyway.
Okay, that makes me feel a lot better. But okay, so when you mentioned the standard HLS feature support, backing that back, so for the context of the kind of the community spec, the Bartos spec, I need to write a spec just so I can have my name next to it, because that always makes me feel really like, Bartos. Yes, I know that guy.
Yes.
So yeah, the Bartos spec talked about like a huge feature of it was it being backwards compatible. It was just like some extension tags, and if your player was low latency aware, then it would use them. But if it wasn't, it was fine. It would just carry on as usual. When you say that this supports the standard HLS feature set, is this also backwards compatible? Is like HLS.js going to be fine with a low latency, even like right now? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It really should be. It is designed to be. There is, as many people kind of listening to this will know, there is a big difference between how the HLS spec is interpreted on some devices. There are certainly devices out there that just, can't deal with unrecognized, XX tags, which kind of suck. But, at a fundamental level, yes, it doesn't redefine anything that already exists in the specification, which is really important. It's only an additive specification, and there is kind of a very strict set of requirements to turn on low latency mode that'll need to be satisfied. And, so long as your players accept, don't crash on tags they don't recognize, it is totally compatible with existing players. You can pick up the latest reference streams from Apple and chuck them in your players already if you do want to check that your player doesn't have issues with them. But yeah, it should totally be compatible with really any existing player that's well written out of there, for sure.
Nice. I mean, I'm sure that's going to break something somewhere.
100%. I could name 2 or 3 devices that will crash, but we'll gloss over those.
I mean, old Android HLS support was flawless, so nothing will go wrong there.
Perfect. And of course, smart TVs are perfect in their reading of HLS specification.
And they stay up to date, which is great.
Yeah, right. Actually, that's a really interesting point as well. One of the things that I think many of us weren't necessarily expecting, and which Apple have done a great job on here, is all of this is now in the RFC version of the HLS specification as well. This isn't an Apple specific extension. This is in the HLS RFC, what Roger has referred to as V2, but is, I think, actually V7 of the HLS RFC, contains all of low latency protocols, including some interoperability stuff and some reference implementation stuff. So, this isn't something that's hopefully only going to exist on Apple devices. This really is something that Apple is saying, hey, here's the HLS RFC. This is a V2 of it. It includes a low latency interoperability mode, and hey, go at it, device manufacturers. Stick it in your smart TV, put it in your set-top box or whatever. So that, I think, is a big positive in this. It's not going to be an Apple specific thing anymore. It's going to be a hopefully industry-wide available for adoption, or at least much more easily.
Nice. Okay, cool. So let's talk about the protocol a little bit underlying this thing. So there was, and I guess before we dig too far into there, I would love to hear a little bit about what happened with some of the more controversial pieces of the initial announcement of this, because there was a lot of the crying and gnashing of teeth was around like, no CDNs really support this. This is like technically really difficult to implement. Like, where have we come from that initial announcement in your mind?
Yeah, great question. Fantastic. It's super interesting. While we're kind of a long way from where the original conversations and the original specification, I actually don't think we're that far at all. Really what the challenges boiled down to in that initial specification and the conversations that came off it was the initial specification had a requirement to push segments push parts, to be more accurate, over HTTP2. The fundamental mechanisms and the fundamental thought process behind this specification hasn't really changed in my mind. When you think about how HLS works at a fundamental level, there is this polling interval on the manifest, right? You have to poll the manifest to see that there's a new segment available, to then ask for that segment. And really, what the idea was all the time behind this version of specification was to try and reduce that polling, to try and minimize the amount of polling and the waiting and the interval that really happened. And this is phrased as, in the case of kind of Roger's presentations, as reducing segment delay. And I think in my mind originally this was about reducing number of round trips, but the way that it's phrased now is kind of reducing segment delay, which is reduce the time spent waiting for a segment to start coming down. And that includes both kind of that poll cycle of polling a manifest and then having to make an upfront request for the segment as well when you know it's become available. So originally, that was fundamentally addressed by HTTP2 push in combination with the manifest request. So starting with something that is still in the new specification, the new version of the specification, is you can now ask for a manifest in advance of it being available, or in this case, slightly specifically, a Delta manifest. So Delta manifests are a new concept in HLS manifests. It allows you to not have to get the full manifest when you want a manifest update. You can just ask for kind of a little snapshot of the latest piece of that manifest. This is great because manifest bloat is a very real thing in HLS, and it's one of the things that Dash generally doesn't suffer from as well. So, you're not transferring around these huge, even if gzipped, list of segments anymore. You're only transferring around these little deltas for the head of your manifest, as it were.
Excuse my ignorance, but is this akin to like HTTP byte range requests? Like how does that delta?
Yeah, you could absolutely look at it that way. It doesn't work as a range request. It kind of could, interestingly. Range requests are something super important in this spec that we'll come on to for sure. Really, you just say, so if you think about how HLS segment numbers work, right, you have this just incrementing segment number. You can say, hey, only give me the manifest after segment 100, for example. And it might be that there's 1 or 2 segments after 200 or whatever. So really just saying, in your manifest response, throw away the first, 100 segments of this manifest, or 1,000 or 10,000. And when you're working with really small segments, that can add up to quite a lot of bloat that's being reduced.
Right.
So really it's this new thing called the Origin API is what it's been referred to as in the specification. But it basically defines a bunch of things that you can set as parameters when you ask for a manifest, including, skip up to a certain part of the manifest. And that's a super cool bit of technology. It's going to make a big difference. It doesn't stop you having to ask for a full manifest when you first start playing back content. So it's still going to be a little bit of bloat when you first start playback. But for like ongoing subscribers, it'll be quite a significant improvement on the chattiness of the protocol, which is great.
Right. So interestingly enough, that almost feels like glorified pagination.
Oh, yeah. Completely agree. So originally, the next kind of step on that was those requests, those partial manifests, were going to be able to block until there was a change. So you'd be able to ask for a Delta manifest update for a manifest, so for kind of these future upcoming parts. I'll talk more about parts in a second, but you're going to be able to ask these upcoming manifest updates before they happen, which is cool. And this is something that survives into the spec today. And this in the specification is called blocking playlist reload. So you ask for an update for playlist before that update has happened. And then when it happens, that request gets unblocked and suddenly you've got that information. Now, originally, when that Delta update was released from a blocking request, originally there was going to be a HTTP2 push chained off the back of that response. So the idea would be that, hey, give me the next manifest update, wait. Okay, the next manifest update's here. By the way, I also happen to know that you're going to need this part of video as well, so I'm going to push that to you at the same time. And that's where the HTTP2 push piece came into this. And that was fundamentally the piece that challenged most of the major CDNs right now. And beyond that, it also created a major problem. So taking a little bit of a step back. So HTTP2 as a general concept is pretty well supported, right?
Yeah, overall.
Yep, it's pretty much something you can get on all the major CDNs as a fundamental piece of functionality.
Most programming languages, HTTP implementation supports it by default now.
Yep. So HTTP2, now a widely supported technology. Unfortunately, HTTP2 push is a less widely supported kind of piece of that specification. From the big CDNs, there was, I think, only one that at the time it was announced could do a HTTP2 push, but specifically a HTTP2 push programmatically. This was something that was kind of available as if kind of all you're doing is like serving a HTML page and you want to push the CSS along with it, was something that was in there for a couple of the major CDNs. But being able to do this programmatically was not something that was available. And Specifically, there was a header that has been defined as the HTTP2 link header, which was being used to link together kind of a couple of objects. So if you were responding with a HTML page, for example, and you wanted to bundle in that CSS, but you needed to do it in a kind of dynamic way, this link header was being used to then kind of give the CDN some knowledge of what other thing to go and get from the origin to then package up for this HTTP2 response that then included a push as well. And what had become the problem there and the limitation, or one of the large limitations with how this was being approached, was while that worked, it required an extra round trip to the origin. So in this Delta manifest update, after this Delta manifest was released back to the CDN would then be reading the link header and saying, oh, shoot, now I have to go off again to the origin and get the partial segment that I need to package up and send as a HTTP2 push. So that was a pretty big sticking point for the CDNs, really. Eliminating that second round trip would have been a big deal, but that just doesn't exist right now as a technology, unfortunately. There is actually a posting from Apple on some of the IETF mailing lists saying, hey, how could we do a chained HTTP2 push? Which was there kind of isn't a way to do it right now, unfortunately. So eliminating that kind of second origin round trip was certainly a big deal for CDNs, and getting a programmatic HTTP2 push in some of the CDNs is going to be a long lead time. And at a fundamental level, at least in my mind, for this technology to gather major adoption, it had to work across all the major CDNs pretty quickly, in my opinion. And that means, that all of the major CDN players had to have a way to get this technology into real time. Because if you think about the use cases for low latency HLS, a lot of the use cases I think in people's minds are, well, let's do my next big sporting event using low latency HLS. And that means having a really good multi-CDN strategy, right? So if you don't have that, then you're in a bit of a pickle. There was one other little complication with the HTTP2 push approach, which was that it did require the manifests and the segments to be served from the same edge hostname, which unfortunately many people in the video industry have spent a very long time decoupling their manifest servers from their kind of media delivery stacks. Speak from experience. And that kind of eliminated all that hard work. So that, again, limited the ability to use a true multi-CDN stack. So, one of the pieces of backing out the HTTP2 push was to deal with that as well.
Interesting. So I will say one thing I've been surprised by in this whole process was I kind of thought that this was coming faster than it did. This is looking at the past with some rosy glasses for sure, but it felt like the community spec, the Bartow spec was close. There were people working on implementations. We were working on an implementation. Felt like there was momentum.
I agree.
And then this spec was released. Everything else halted, came to a screeching halt because it was just why work on something that's just going to die in a few months, theoretically. And then I kind of thought that we would see a few big names rolling it out almost immediately. And that just hasn't happened as far as I know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there's a few factors to that in my mind. I think really with the feedback from hey, this HTTP2 push stuff is going to be really hard, I think that put a stopping path on it. And, a lot of people in the industry did obviously start working on it. And there were some products that announced compatibility that, were based on the initial version of specification as well. But obviously without kind of any really good place to play it, or a comprehensive cross environment place to play it, there wasn't much noise about that really. And I agree, it suddenly, it felt like there was a lot of momentum behind getting a ultra low latency solution in place, or even a consistent, reliable 5-second latency in place, right? Which I think was a big halt on. I think there was a component of once bitten, twice shy about this. When in October there were 2 meetings with Apple, which involved large portions of the video streaming industry, one after Mahai Video in Denver and one after Demuxed in Cupertino. And I think, in late last year, it became pretty clear that there were going to be changes, namely to remove the HTTP to push piece of the puzzle. So I think really people understood that, without changes to specification, there wasn't going to be mass adoption. I think now we've got a timeline of, it being in iOS, tvOS, watchOS, and macOS and that sort of thing. We're going to see a lot more momentum behind it this time for sure. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited to see everyone's implementations and really excited to see how quickly it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, this is something as an industry we desperately need. And honestly, I'm kind of shocked that we haven't seen Dash eat up more market share. And market share is not the right phrase, but you know what I mean? I'm surprised like Dash just hasn't kind of left HLS in the dust because of this. And that's purely because of iOS's power. But that's kind of surprising to me.
I completely agree with you. This was arguably one of the biggest opportunities for Dash to gain market share. But I completely agree. If you can't do it on iOS, for many organizations, that can be 60+% of viewership, depending on, your target market. So, if you can't hit your primary market, then why bother, right? And as well, I think beyond that, there is a reluctance in many organizations to give that split experience, right? That, hey, if you're watching on an iPhone, sorry, you get, 30 seconds latency, but hey, good, get an Android phone or watch on your desktop and you'll get, ultra low latency 5 seconds. I think there is a big reluctance in traditional media outlets, particularly to give that split user experience for sure.
Oh, it looks like you just made a shitty app on one platform is what that ends up looking like.
On the premium platform as well. Right. That's like, it's like, oh, you've got a $1,200 iPhone 11 Pro. Yeah, sorry, that's going to be 30 seconds latency. Yeah.
So speaking of Dash, you've mentioned parts a few times. Are we still with TS here? Like, how does that look in this new spec?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that hasn't changed from the first version of the specification. So one of the core pieces of this new specification is what Apple are calling parts. And they have a little bit of a flexible definition of that, but I would say think of this as something smaller than a segment that doesn't necessarily have to contain a complete GOP, is how I would define it. And Apple consider these to be either a small chunk of TS, it still has to be a valid a valid TS segment as it was, just shorter and not necessarily with an iframe in it, or Apple defined this as a Cmaf chunk. And that's super exciting because, as you mentioned, Dash low latency also uses Cmaf chunks. Now, a Cmaf chunk isn't anything super special. It's a MOOF MDAT tuple, which contains, some video data, and maybe has an iframe, maybe doesn't. And the idea is that these parts are between Apple have a pretty flexible definition of how long a part can be. I would say, roughly speaking, parts are going to be between 300 milliseconds or 333 milliseconds probably, and probably a second at the higher end. And they, are just kind of sub-segments or sub-fragments of your more traditional segment as you think of it in a HLS playlist. So the exciting thing is those are fundamentally interchangeable with Dash low latency as a chunk of media, which is great. So I think this is going to be a big driver for, people. People have already obviously started merging their Dash and HLS delivery chains as HLS introduced, Cmaf delivery a while ago now. So that's available to most Apple devices these days. But this is going to be another encouragement to kind of unify that delivery stack for sure.
Nice. Okay, with all of these other things that we're talking about in the HLS spec, Dash having their own low latency thing, does this start to get us to a place where you mentioned earlier, like people had started going down this path of like breaking apart manifest generation from media, and that was actually looking pretty good for a little while there because we'd already gotten to fragmented MP4 support in new versions of iOS, which meant that Dash and HLS could support the same underlying segments. And so you could just generate different manifests. Does this new spec, like the Cmaf support seems like it helps there, but everything else I'm hearing about this feels like you would really be kind of building two completely disparate systems if you wanted to support low latency Dash and this low latency version of HLS. Am I reading that wrong?
So that was certainly true of the first version of specification. Of this version, no. You should be able to use one delivery chain for your media to deliver both your Cmaf chunks as parts for Apple's low latency HLS and -LL kind of Cmaf chunks as well. They should be completely interchangeable. They are basically delivered in kind of the exact same way. Because of the dropping of a requirement for HTTP2 push, Apple's requirement now is just that you can get a Cmaf chunk, and there's some really interesting intricacy. We'll go into it in a minute around how you can get these Cmaf chunks, but they are the kind of the delivery technique. While it kind of is described a little bit differently in the two specifications, Apple have been fairly reluctant to call what they're doing chunked transfer encoding, but it really is chunk transfer encoding by any other name at this point. I think they do actually call it chunk transfer in the latest version, but the caveat there is like chunk transfer encoding doesn't really exist in HTTP2. It's just something without a content length header. So it's a little more complicated than that from a definition perspective. So what the beauty is of this specification is, from a practical standpoint, it is interchangeable. So we've talked a little bit about these chunks. These are advertised. If you think about the dumbest implementation you could do for a low latency HLS, what happens is you load up your playlist. You then download, the last segment, and then you look at the part definitions. So these are new definitions in the playlist called extxpart, and they just pretty much have a URL to a part in them. And then kind of the dumbest implementation is the player fetches those parts and off it goes. And it can just really small parts. Now, that'll fall apart really quickly, which is why Apple have the blocking preload hint for media. So this is where the manifest can contain a what's called XX preload hint. So what this is effectively a notification of an upcoming part. So this is saying to the player, hey, you can request this part. And this is just the exact same technologies they're using on the blocking playlist reload, which is you can request this part in advance of it becoming available. And you can also request the playlist in advance of it becoming available. So if you know that there's an upcoming little chunk of media, you can ask for it before the encoder has even generated it. And the CDN and the packager are going to have to hold on to that request until it's available. So this is kind of reducing all of that segment delay concept that we talked about earlier on. So that's kind of the first step of implementing this would be to, hey, ask for these parts and ask for these playlist deltas upfront before they're available. And, that reduces this segment delay in getting these parts down to you, which is great. That alone doesn't really make you interchangeable with Dash low latency. Dash low latency uses kind of traditional chunk transfer encoding, delivering Cmaf chunks. So, the encoder and packager generate, you ask for segment 4 and the packager goes, cool, here's a bit of segment 4. Then the player can decode that and play it. Here's another bit of segment 4. Okay, decode and play. Here's another bit of segment 4, etc. So if you imagine like a 2-second segment, that could be split up into 4 500 millisecond Cmaf chunks. And, in Apple's world, yep, you could do the same. And you could just actually add those as like parts onto the bottom of your manifest, and that would work just fine. You could even address them as byte ranges if you wanted. But the elegance of what Apple have actually designed here goes a little bit beyond that. So you can define a part as a byte range, but you can also define a part as a byte range of an upcoming segment that doesn't yet have a length. So if you imagine you've generated segment 3, you're about to start generating segment 4. You start delivering segment 4, you can make a range request for bytes 0 kind of onwards in that segment. So the way that Apple have want this to work is that just like in chunk transfer encoding, you would send that Cmaf chunk as soon as you had it available. The idea is, provided you can make an upfront range request for kind of that whole segment, you can just deal with it as if it was like chunk transfer encoded, sending these 500 millisecond Cmaf chunks down. Now, the idea is you would still be updating your playlist while you were doing this request. You'd still be saying, and and we now know how long that Cmaf part was, that chunk was. So I now know the length. If anyone else was joining the stream, it can catch up by using exact byte ranges rather than having to make this open-ended request. It can catch up using like little bits of the request. And there's other reasons you might want to request subparts anyway, mainly due to if you need to jump between playlists more efficiently. So there is reasons you might want that outside of the startup behavior. So there are totally other reasons you might want to ask for parts individually with knowing their range outside of just the startup behavior as well.
So this byte range addressability of the parts themselves, would that allow you to in traditional HLS manifests, a really common thing to do was like stitch together manifest, toss an ext discontinuity tag in between them, and then bam, you've got like concatenated playlists. So people did this all the time for pre-rolls and ad insertion, all that sort of stuff. Where it didn't work very well at all is if you didn't have a perfect clip between the two. So would this allow you to do, I hesitate to say like frame accurate, but could you reasonably use this byte range request to start mid this chunk or this part and mid this chunk and then stitch those manifests together? Is that the kind of thing this would allow, or is that kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about here?
Oh man, I wish I could answer that with 100% confidence. I think you can discontinuity in the middle of a part, but I'm not 100% sure.
Got it. So this right now, this is more from the perspective of like jumping into a playlist, not necessarily like within like sub manifest.
Yeah, that's correct.
Got it.
So this is super cool. If you imagine treating two interchangeable head ends the same way, one for -LL and one for LLHLS, we're kind of now there, because you can deliver these as long as you're using kind of the byte range addressable format within LLHLS that is fundamentally compatible with -LL, which is super exciting. It should just work. Now, there's a caveat. There always is. There is a little bit of work remaining to be done on the CDN end of this. Some CDNs don't currently support responding with a kind of sub piece of something that you're byte range addressing. Some CDNs will consider like that open-ended byte range request to be completed on like the first and it's finished. Like it's complicated, but there is a little bit of work to do on some CDMs for sure to get to a place where that will be working kind of completely compatible with everything else. So just kind of it's a little more complicated, because while this is working today on all major CDNs for -LL, doing it with an open-ended range request is not how -LL is doing it today. It's just doing a HTTP GET for that upcoming segment, rather than what we'll be doing in LLHLS, which is a range request for that upcoming segment as well. So it is subtly different, and that does require a little bit of work for sure.
Got it. So at one point you mentioned being able to jump between renditions. That's always kind of been one of those things where it works in HLS today. That's one of the big benefits, but it can be a little jarring or slow. Like, is that related? Like, what do you mean when you say jumping between renditions? How does that change from the current implementations?
Yeah, it changes a little bit. And one of the challenges with doing this, and as we discussed in the first episode, one of the challenges with all low latency technologies is you're always going to have this trade-off, right? This trade-off of stability and buffer length and scalability for a chunk of latency. So being able to react to changing network conditions in a low latency mode is really, really important, right? you're so much more impacted by minor network fluctuations than you otherwise would be if you've got a significant buffer built up. So what Apple wanted to do is have a way to jump between renditions really quickly. And to enable that, they've added something called Rendition Reports. This is something that was actually originally optional in the spec, but has now become mandatory. And effectively all this does is allow you in a response to a playlist or a Delta playlist update to give the client a peek into another playlist, and in fact to give a client a peek into all other playlists now as it has become mandatory. So you just basically say, hey, I'm on part 42 of the following segment, and so that if you needed to make a Delta manifest request for a different rendition, you would be able to do that without necessarily needing to go and fetch that whole manifest, parsing it all, working out where you are. So it reduces the round trips when you just want to jump as quickly as possible into a different rendition, which should make a big difference. Something we haven't talked about extensively that I think is exciting is, obviously, bandwidth estimation is hard for low latency. You're so much more sensitive to jitter and that sort of thing. And that's one of the things that the HTTP2 push change had a big challenge with as well. HTTP2 push was not going to be easy to measure in a browser, whereas this approach should be a good chunk easier to measure performance-wise in a browser. So hopefully, that then means that rendition reports are much more useful, obviously, because you are able to understand quicker when you have a bandwidth-constrained network. So that's important for sure.
That's awesome. Thanks for the high-level overview. Well, that wasn't even that high level, but thank you for the overview there, Phil. Okay, probably should give a quick overview of what's going on with Demuxed right now. We've kind of mentioned this a few times. You've probably heard rumors or seen stuff around, but we are going to be an online native event this year. It's official. By the time this podcast is released, the website should be up and the emails should have gone out. And the call for paper should be open. So it's open for all of July, 2020.demuxed.com/submit. The deal is same dates as we were planning in person, October 7th and 8th, with bonus 6th. And part of the reasoning there is we're going to try to go in the morning, particularly since Demuxed Europe was the first casualty of COVID. This allows us to reasonably allow a lot of Europe to also join if we maintain most of the talks being more in the morning. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do 3 days, keep the content in the morning, keep the afternoons free. That way Europe can still join. Most of the US can still join comfortably. And that way we can try to be at least a little bit more internationally friendly. But yeah, so we'll take talks. We'll help you record them. It's going to be great. We're really excited. I mean, there's like Phil and I've been talking about this a lot. And honestly, to be terribly honest, I've been procrastinating making the announcement because it sucks. Like I really enjoy like seeing a lot of people in person in an avenue that's not like a giant soulless trade floor. There's something really exciting about like seeing a lot of friends in the industry that way.
Oh yeah.
And it's a bummer that like that's not going to happen this year. So just want to be upfront that part does kind of suck a little bit. That being said, we're actually really, really excited about the possibilities here. Like we've got a lot of great ideas about how we want to handle chat interaction and what the speaker experience looks like. And we've been going to a lot of online events.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And speaking at them. I think we've at least got a good framework for how a well-run online event looks and how we can make it a good experience for everybody involved, or at least as good as can be expected given the circumstances of everybody needing to be home.
Yeah, I think we're lucky from that perspective, right? We're in October. The world has had a little bit of time to adjust to this stuff, and we're not going to be one of the first, rushing to do this. So I think that gives us a great opportunity.
Totally, 100%. And the other piece of good news here is I will not get a single complaint about chairs this year.
Man, my sofa is so uncomfortable, Matt. Please ship me a sofa.
Yeah. If anybody's complaining about their chair this year, that is your own damn fault. You should probably make an investment there.
This Aeron is just not acceptable.
But yeah, we'll figure out some other fun. Like there's some other fun stuff that we've got in the pipeline around swag and
Oh yeah, so excited.
all sorts of stuff like that. Making sure to give to good causes, that's a piece of this too.
Mhm.
So we wrote a whole thing online. You should go read it about the reasoning and logistics, all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
If you have thoughts, questions, suggestions, feel free to reach out. And we're also doing a matching right now. So part of the ticket sales, that's all going to go to social awareness causes. But if you want to give right now, outside of your ticket, we're matching up to $5,000 of donations. The places we'll be donating our matches to is splitting between the ACLU and Dev Color, which if you're not familiar, you should look it up. It's really great.
Yep.
They're in our YC batch. We're friendly. But we will also accept donations to other organizations, bail funds. If there are organizations that you know that are working with diversity, inclusion, and social justice, feel free to donate to those and just send us the receipt, and we'll match to ACLU or Dev Color as part of that.
And especially if you're international, if there's someone local like me, please do feel free to donate to your local charity as well, for sure.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen, and we look forward to recording more of these. And as always, let us know what you think, and hopefully we'll see you at least online in October.
Yeah, and tell us what subjects you want us to cover as well. We'd love to get more feedback on that as well.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
That's all we have for today, but as always, we'd love to hear what you thought, even if you disagree, so please reach out on Twitter at Demuxed.
To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, be sure to check out their library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.